It was December 22nd, 1981. A cleaning woman had just started her morning rounds, sorting the rooms of the Sand and Sage Motel in Odessa, Texas. She approached room 126 with her trolley and unlocked the door. What had been up until that moment a fairly routine morning was instantly shattered. The room was a total mess. The walls were covered with dry blood. Holes had been punched through them. The air conditioning unit was ripped from the wall. The coffee tables flipped over. Bed frame had been broken. The phone had been ripped out from the socket. Television smashed. And clothes, beer cans and cigarette butts were thrown all across the floor. The room was not just a mess, it had been destroyed. The state of the room was all the more perplexing by the fact that guests of that room had only checked in the night before, and no one had reported any sort of disturbance from the other rooms. That was when the cleaning lady noticed. The guest was still in the room. A man was laying face down, naked on the floor, covered in blood, with his hands tied behind his back with a sock. He was dead. Despite plenty of hair and bloody fingerprints, the police were unable to identify this man, nor who could have done this to him. He had registered at the hotel under a false identity, but just 1 week later, on December 26, a group of church parishioners would gather at the morgue and identify the deceased man as their priest, Father Patrick Ryan. Shortly after this, a drunken confession would see a seemingly innocent man spend years behind bars for his murder. But we'll get into that a little later. 1 year later, December 4th, 1982, a tall blonde man dressed like a cowboy walked into Sacred Heart Catholic Church in Boise, Idaho. He approached a confessional but discovered it was already in use. The man was stressed by this. He clearly had something to confess and it appeared time was of great importance to him. So instead he went and sat on the pews, quiet and alone. A funeral mass was due to be held there that evening, and around 5 PM head usher Leo Leeburn arrived with his mother Grace. Leo was walking down the aisle of the church when he accidentally kicked something with his foot. There was a man laying face down and unresponsive. He quickly called for a local nurse to come and help who had also just arrived, telling her that a man had collapsed. But nothing could be done. The man was dead. No one at the church recognized the man at all. The nurse rushed to the priest, Father Thomas Fulcher, and told him what happened. Father Fulcher quickly phoned the police, and within half an hour Sergeant Frank Richardson arrived on the scene. He bent down to search the body. What he found was very unusual indeed. In his shirt pocket was a brown envelope that contained 19 $100 bills, a total of $1,900, and a typewritten note on a small sheet of paper. The note read, "In the event of my death, the enclosed currency should give more than adequate compensation for my funeral or disposal. Prefer to be cremated. Expenditures. What is left over, please take this as a contribution to the church. God will see to your honesty in this." It was signed W.M.L. Toomey. In all the images I have found of this note, it appears there is another line at the end that is blacked out, but I didn't come across any explanation of why it was blacked out, or what it was supposed to have said. The discovery of this man's body would kickstart a mystery that to this day remains unsolved. We're getting into some pretty dark real life topics in this entry of the tape library that may be genuinely upsetting to some of you. So if you want some more harmless spooky tales, then maybe give this one a miss, and I'll be back very soon with another paranormal case. But if not, then get comfortable. This is a story of false confessions, tragic abuse, murder, and one of the most perplexing cold cases of all time. Let's delve into the strange mystery of William Toomey. The man who was found in the church that day began to be referred to as William L. Toomey, based on the note found with him. It was assumed that WM was a shortening of William. William L. Toomey was a white male, estimated to be between 35 and 45 years old. He stood around 6 feet tall and weighed approximately 175 pounds. He had sandy, wavy blonde hair, grey eyes with hints of brown, a clean-shaven face, and tanned skin. His attire was described as Western style, with a long-sleeved green shirt, blue jeans, a large belt buckle containing a 100-peso coin in the centre, a turquoise and silver bolo tie, cowboy boots, and a psycho wristwatch. The tanned skin was notable because it was an unusual thing to have in the Idaho winter. Based on his appearance, many believed it was likely he was from the southwestern part of the US. In the man's back pocket, Sergeant Richardson found a wallet containing only $53 in cash. All personal identification had been removed, though the worn spots in the wallet indicated it once held numerous items. It appeared the man had deliberately destroyed any identifying materials before entering the church. Authorities checked missing persons reports across the US and Canada, but found no match for William L. Toomey. Investigators believed the name was likely an alias, and Sergeant Richardson doubted the man would remove all his identification and then use his real name on the note. He also observed that the man's signature lacked the natural letter formation one might expect if it were genuine, suggesting he even went to great lengths to disguise his handwriting. This was a man who did not want to be identified. During his autopsy, it was discovered that Toomey had ingested cyanide. How he had gotten a cyanide capsule, though, remains a mystery. Despite fingerprinting, no matches were found in either the FBI or Idaho state databases. Numerous leads on his identity were pursued nationwide, but none provided answers. Sergeant Richardson believes the man had planned to take his life during or shortly after confession with the church's priest. Witnesses recalled seeing him seated in a pew near the confessional around 4 p.m, suggesting he may have already taken the capsule and hadn't expected to be waiting to speak to the priest, meaning that instead he likely passed away while still waiting. Both Sergeant Richardson and Father Fulcher sensed a connection between the man and the Catholic Church. He had clearly chosen this place for his death for a reason. Father Fulcher speculated that some event in the man's life drove him to end it, but he wanted to do so in a way that allowed him to reconcile with God. He also believed he seemed to choose a church to spare his family the trauma of finding him, and to ensure he would receive a respectful farewell. Sergeant Richardson was quoted as saying he didn't want his identity to be known for whatever reason. It's strange. And Fulcher was suspicious of why the man had decided to do this, saying the guy had done something bad enough for him to take his own life. In effect, he sentenced himself to death. Interestingly, the name Toomey did lead investigators to a manufacturer of clergy attire in Massachusetts called R.J. Toomey, but it would appear no one involved in the company seemed to know the mysterious deceased man. Numerous news reports about the death were made and a sketch of the man was released, but no one came forward to identify him. Father Fulcher explained that he and his parishioners embraced the unknown man as one of their own, feeling that he symbolised those who struggle with loneliness, depression and despair, especially during the holiday season, which seems at odds with his quote about believing the man must have done something wrong. Either way, they wanted to show that people facing such hardships have a place where they belong, and in choosing their church, this man chose to belong with them. Because of this, he was given a funeral service that was attended by members of the church, but none of them knew the man and had never seen him before. Toomey was laid to rest in Boise's Dry Creek Cemetery, though his wishes to be cremated couldn't be honoured due to his unknown identity. In his memory, the church members added a plaque to the entrance of their prayer garden with the words, "Unknown Wanderer." While the church were happy to lay the man to rest, investigators were obviously much more keen on understanding why the man had done this. Why didn't he want to be identified? Where had he gotten cyanide from? Had he done something? There was the suggestion that maybe he could have been connected to the case of the Tylenol murders just a few months prior. In late September, across 3 days in Chicago, 7 people were tragically killed when they took Tylenol that had been laced with cyanide. Someone had tampered with the bottles of the store-bought medication and was poisoning people. A man by the name of James Lewis was arrested after sending an extortion letter to Johnson & Johnson, demanding $1 million to stop the killing. While he spent 12 years in prison for the attempted extortion, he was never actually charged with the Tylenol killings, leading some to believe that the real culprit got away scot-free. Some have then suggested that Toomey was the man responsible for the murders and decided to take his own life in the same manner he had taken the lives of his victims, but wanted to confess what he had done before doing so. Although, beyond the cyanide capsule, I don't think there's much that connects the two cases, and if he was so desperate to confess, why not mention it in his note? But can we be 100% certain that Toomey didn't actually manage a confession before passing away? Despite the fact that he seemed to be a kind and forgiving man with his words towards Toomey, there is speculation that Father Fulcher may have actually known the man, for he was holding a dark secret of his own. But to get into that, we need to talk about a whole other unsolved case. The priest murders. Father Patrick Ryan was found murdered in that motel room 90 miles away from where he lived in Denver City and presenting a false name to check in. Ryan had been a priest at the St. William's Church in Denver City since 1979. He was known to pick up hitchhikers, which at the time was seen as an act of generosity on his part. Ryan often gave rides to hitchhikers along the 30-mile stretch between Denver City and Hobbs, New Mexico. On December 6, 1981, the 49-year-old priest picked up a man named James Reyes, a hitchhiker travelling to Hobbs in search of work. For some reason, Ryan gave his name as John when he introduced himself. They drove into town together, where they spent an evening at a local bar drinking. Later that night, Ryan drove Reyes back to Denver City, dropping him off outside the St. William's Rectory. Reyes only learned that John was a priest after this drop-off, and it wasn't until later when he saw the news reports about Ryan's murder in Odessa that he discovered the priest's true identity. Over the next 2 weeks, Ryan and Reyes met up several times to chat and drink, clearly enjoying one another's company. But on December 20th, Reyes said that Ryan assaulted him in the rectory's living room. According to Reyes, Father Ryan grabbed him by his collar and forced him to perform oral sex on him. Once it was over, Reyes ran out of the building, leaving behind a backpack containing a number of his personal belongings, including a photo album. I'm going to get into Reyes' movements following this now. It's detailed, but I promise it's important for what happens next. The following morning, Reyes found a $750 check in his mailbox, his share of royalties from mineral rights on his Apache reservation. The money allowed Reyes to reclaim his pickup truck, which he had surrendered as collateral to a bail bondsman in Hobbs after a recent arrest for driving without a license. In need of a ride to Hobbs, Reyes decided to ask Father Ryan for help. Nervously, Reyes returned to the rectory, where Ryan met him at the door and apologised for the previous night, saying, "I don't know what got into me." Reyes dismissed the incident and asked Ryan for a ride to Hobbs, and Ryan agreed. Along the way, they picked up a middle-aged man hitchhiking west. The three men arrived at bondsman Charlie Bostic's office in Hobbs around 11:30 AM, where Reyes went inside to arrange his truck's release. Reyes had asked Ryan to wait for him, but while Reyes was inside talking with Bostic's daughter, a detail that was later confirmed in court, Ryan drove off, leaving Reyes behind. According to Reyes, this was the last time he saw Father Ryan. Reyes obtained his truck and stopped at Tip's Bar for a beer, where he ran into an old friend called Harold, who accompanied him to a nearby auto parts store. Reyes bought gas and a new gas cap, keeping the time-stamped receipts as usual. After dropping Harold off around 1:30 PM, Reyes headed north in his truck, planning to spend the Christmas holiday with family in Albuquerque. As Reyes was leaving Hobbs, he unexpectedly encountered the same hitchhiker that he and Father Ryan had picked up earlier that morning. The man, who has never been identified, told Reyes that Ryan had suddenly stopped a few blocks from the bailsman's office, dropped him off and driven away, which seemed strange. Reyes offered the man a ride and they continued on, stopping at a gas station at around 4:30 PM, which once again provided him with a time-stamped receipt. They reached Roswell about 6 PM, and Reyes dropped the hitchhiker at the bus station. Afterwards, Reyes decided to take a drive through the eastern New Mexico University campus, where he had studied the previous year. There he ran into an old college friend called David Meyer. They brought a case of beer and went to Meyer's house and spent a few hours drinking and catching up. Meyer later testified that Reyes left around 8:30 p.m, which is estimated to be around the time that Father Ryan was murdered. Reyes then drove about 15 miles southeast to Bottomless Lake State Park, before heading east to Tatum, where he stopped for gas once again, keeping a receipt that he later handed over to Odessa police. Continuing his drive, Reyes drank beer as he went, until a state trooper pulled him over for speeding around 12:15 a.m, just 15 miles west of Roswell. After receiving a ticket, Reyes drove on, but his truck soon ended up in a ditch. A passing motorist stopped to help and noticed that Reyes was very drunk. He drove him and his truck back to a restaurant in Roswell. There, Reyes discovered that his truck now had a flat tire. He went inside to call for a tow truck, and the wrecker's receipt later recorded the time as 4 a.m. After he was towed to a nearby truck stop and the tire was replaced, Reyes fell asleep in the vehicle. Around 8 a.m. on December 22nd, he was spotted by numerous people throughout the day, and eventually continued on his way to Albuquerque that evening. All of this combined paints a clear picture of Reyes' movements throughout the time that Father Ryan was apparently murdered. The room Father Ryan was found in clearly bore signs of a violent struggle. It was noted that there was ample evidence that could lead them to the killer. No one had gone to any great lengths to cover their tracks here. Investigators found hairs on the body and carpet, blood-stained fingerprints, stained bedding, and smoked cigarette butts. However, they had no ID for the victim, and the name and address he had used to check in were quickly identified as fake. For 4 days, Ryan remained in the morgue, labelled as a John Doe. Back in Denver City, parishioners grew increasingly worried as the priest's absence stretched on. When he missed both Christmas Eve and Christmas Day services, the head of the church's men's group climbed through a window in the rectory to search for any clues that might help locate him. Inside, he found some puzzling signs. On the stove was a cold, fully cooked meal of steak and potatoes, with white grease congealed around the steak, suggesting it had been left for some time. It seemed Father Ryan had not been planning to leave the rectory on the night he was murdered. On a chair, he spotted a backpack, with a photo album inside. Soon after this, Father Ryan was identified. Later that same day, Odessa police, with the backpack in hand, arrived at Reyes' apartment. Reyes had just returned from New Mexico the night before. Detective Jerry Smith questioned Reyes for 4 hours about his recent movements, and asked why his backpack was in the rectory. Reyes recounted everything that he could remember, handing over his collection of receipts to verify his account, although I am unsure if he references the assault at this point. The officers inspected Reyes for any cuts or bruises, finding only a small scratch on his hand. This is notable due to the clearly violent altercation that happened in the motel room. It would be hard to believe there would be barely a scratch on the assailant. On December 27th, Reyes passed the polygraph test, seemingly putting an end to the matter. But Reyes couldn't let it go. In later interviews, even to this day, Reyes still seems to hold guilt for what happened, saying that if he hadn't called on him that morning, he'd still be alive. He felt guilty over the sexual assault as well, despite being the victim. This man was a priest. How could he be to blame for what happened? Clearly, Reyes thought he was responsible for what had happened. He was a gay man who had been repressing his sexuality since he was a child, due to his conservative upbringing within his native tribe that looked down on homosexuality. This had led him to become a clearly troubled man with a drinking problem. Despite the assault, he had developed a bond with Father Ryan, and blaming himself, he ended up calling the police in a drunken mess 11 months later, confessing to the murder, claiming that he had slit Father Ryan's throat. This wasn't even how Father Ryan had died. He had apparently been beaten to death, and once he sobered up, Reyes quickly recanted his confession. But it was too late. Despite the evidence showing that it was physically impossible for Reyes to have been there to commit the murder, he was found guilty by a jury of the murder, with one juror disturbingly saying they found him guilty based on his confession and characteristics. Reyes would remain in prison until the early 2000s. After release, he would find himself being locked up on multiple occasions due to breaching his bail conditions. During the entire time, he kept protesting his innocence, and numerous people who looked into his case desperately tried to free him, but to no avail. Eventually, in 2023, Reyes was exonerated, after 40 years of being called a murderer. Many of Reyes' supporters were convinced that William Toomey was somehow involved in the murder of the priest, and that he took his own life due to the guilt. While there doesn't seem to be any concrete evidence for that, there was one interesting detail. The distinctive belt buckle that Toomey was wearing would be traced back to a gift shop in Arizona, and while that didn't connect him to Father Ryan's murder, it did put him in the right location for something else. Ryan wouldn't be alone. Another priest who reportedly was fond of helping out hitchhikers was found dead in November of 1982, just 1 month before William Toomey would appear in that church. On November 10th, Father Benjamin Carrier checked into the El Rancho Motel in Yuma, Arizona. There seems to be some discrepancies of this from the sources I read. One said that Carrier checked in alone, but the hotel receptionist saw another man sitting in Carrier's vehicle outside. Another source states that he was then seen later in the motel pool with 2 men. But either way, it appears he was accompanied by 2 men, believed to be hitchhikers, that he had picked up along the way. One afternoon, around 2:15 PM, police were called to the motel to investigate a report of a possible deceased person. Upon entering the room, officers found Father Carrier in a scene hauntingly similar to that of Father Ryan's. He was laying naked on the bed, with his hands bound behind his back, but in this case the cause of death was determined to be asphyxiation. Carrier's truck was missing from the motel parking lot and was discovered 2 days later, abandoned in Las Vegas. Authorities were unable to locate the 2 men last seen with him, and their identities remain unknown. Strikingly, nothing appears to have been stolen from Carrier, except the truck, which was quickly abandoned, leaving no clear motive for the murder. The lack of robbery or other apparent purpose suggested a sinister intent behind the crime, casting a shadow of mystery over Carrier's final hours. Carrier had run into issues before while picking up hitchhikers, including being robbed, but those that knew him said he was a kind man who was always trying to help others, particularly working with those who suffered from substance abuse. While within the context of the Father Ryan story, the idea of taking these 2 hitchhikers to a motel seems a little more suspect. He could have equally been helping them out with somewhere to stay. To this day, Father Carrier's murder has not been solved. Investigators are still trying to solve the case. 2 sketches were provided of the men that were spotted at the motel, and some have suggested there is a resemblance to the sketch of William Toomey, but I personally really don't see it myself. These are the 2 cases that some investigators, including Sergeant Richardson himself, are convinced are connected to the Toomey case, but they weren't the only priests to show up murdered around that time. Late in the evening of August 5th, 1982, a man who identified himself as Michael Carmelo called St. Francis Cathedral, requesting a priest to administer last rites to his dying grandfather at a remote rest stop outside of town. The first priest who answered was unavailable, so when the man called back about 15 minutes later, Father Rivera took the call. Without hesitation, he agreed to drive out to the rest stop. Tragically, he would never return. When Father Rivera failed to return that night, the church reported him missing. Over the following 2 days, hundreds of community members joined in a search across Santa Fe and the surrounding areas. On August 7th, his body was discovered in the desert. Evidence indicated that he had been tied up at some point, and he had been fatally shot. Investigators noted that his body had been moved post-mortem, which seemed strange given there were ample secluded spots nearby. It appeared as though his killer had deliberately placed him to be found. The next day, Rivera's car was discovered abandoned about 2 hours from Santa Fe. Nothing was missing from the car or from Father Rivera's belongings, except for his last rites kit, which was presumed to have been taken as a twisted keepsake. The investigation pointed to the possibility of multiple assailants, as Father Rivera was known to be physically strong, suggesting it would have taken 2 people to subdue him. Witnesses reported seeing a blue pickup truck parked at the rest stop before Father Rivera arrived. The authorities believe that he was likely held at gunpoint, killed elsewhere, and then his body transported to the desert for later discovery. The killers then returned to take his car, but it then ran out of gas and they were forced to abandon it. No suspects were ever identified, but police suspected the killers harboured resentment towards the Catholic Church, and they hadn't specifically requested Father Rivera, but had instead asked for any available priest. Some have also suggested a link to the murder of Father John Kerrigan in Montana, who went missing in July of 1984. Father Kerrigan's absence first went unnoticed until he missed the 6:30 AM Mass on July 21st. However, it wasn't until 2 days later, on July 23rd, that he was officially reported missing. Nearly a week later, on July 29th, searchers discovered bloody clothing and a coat hanger stained with blood along the edge of Montana Highway 35. Then on July 30th, Father Kerrigan's brown Chevy Malibu was found abandoned several miles from the initial site. Inside the car's trunk, investigators discovered his wallet that still contained over $1,000 in cash, as well as a blood-stained shovel and a bloodied pillowcase. Father Kerrigan himself has never been located, and his disappearance remains shrouded in mystery, with only these haunting pieces of evidence left behind. The connection to this murder is a lot looser. It takes place in a different area of the country, and Toomey was obviously already dead by this point. However, for those of you who believe these cases are connected, it is pointed out that the belief is that there is more than one person involved in the murders. William Toomey could have been one, but presumably his accomplice would still be out there somewhere. So how does this tie into Toomey? Obviously the belt buckle connects him to Arizona for the second murder, but that on its own feels like a very loose connection. The key to the mystery, some suggest, is the church that Toomey chose to die in, the Sacred Heart Catholic Church in Boise. In 2018, Father Fulcher, the same priest who had laid Toomey to rest, was sentenced to 25 years in prison. It was discovered that he had thousands of images of child abuse on his computer. In online chat logs, it was discovered that he had shared fantasies of sexual abuse and even murder. He would also discuss slavery, an interest in Satanism, and even claimed to have urinated in the mass wine that he gave to his practitioners. Fulcher would die in prison in 2020. Father John Kerrigan was featured on a list of 80 clergy members who had been suspected or implicated in the sexual abuse of minors that the Diocese of Helena was forced to release after a class action lawsuit. A Father Patrick Ryan has also been named as an abuser, although there does seem to be a lack of clarity of if this is the same priest who assaulted James Reyes. The other two priests have never been directly accused of anything, but both have worked in a diocese that had numerous allegations against it. If the theories are true, and Toomey did have something to do with the murders of these other priests, could he have been in Boise that day for another reason? Maybe he intended to do something else to Father Fulcher, before deciding that he could no longer go through with his plans. Was Toomey and maybe another accomplice acting as vigilantes against the abuse being committed within the church? So what really happened? The story I've just laid out is the theories and events that have been placed together over the years, from people involved in the case, and others who have taken an interest in the story at a later date. And to be honest, I have some pretty big issues with it. All we know for certain is that a man went to great lengths to disguise his identity before taking his own life inside a church in Idaho. While the connections to the various priest murders are interesting, there isn't anything concrete connecting William Toomey to them, except for the fact that he at least apparently visited a gift shop in Arizona at some point, and the murders happened around the same time. I'm not sure if I've missed a key part of the story here. I've read news reports, detailed articles, blogs, listened to multiple podcasts, and none of them seem to explain why everyone was so convinced Toomey was connected to any of those murders, beyond just a hunch. It's very possible that there is a piece of evidence that Sergeant Frank Richardson had that led him down this rabbit hole, but I can't really tell what it was. I also feel a little uncomfortable about the fact that Father Carrier and Father Rivera have been pulled into this narrative about abusive priests, because as far as I can tell they never had any allegations made against them. While a connection is possible, I don't like that two men who were murdered have been pulled into this after their deaths, and with no allegations or evidence against them, particularly when one appears to have been chosen to be murdered, simply for being the priest that was available that night. Likewise, painting Toomey as a potential serial killer with no concrete evidence doesn't sit right with me, even if some see him as some sort of avenging angel, taking out those who have harmed children. It is worth noting though that the connections to at least the murders of Father Ryan and Father Carrier were made long before the crimes of Father Fulcher came to light. In the case of Father Ryan, one source I read mentioned that 3 different sets of fingerprints were connected to the murder, all of which belonged to 3 men from the Odessa area. But none of those men were ever charged, and all have since passed away. So on top of the mystery, you also have what appears to be a tragic miscarriage of justice taking place regarding James Reyes. This is such a weird story. It kind of feels like you have a whole bunch of different mysteries going on at once, and people have tried to tie them together, but the only person who would know for certain died in that church in 1982. There is one final detail to add to this strange case. In 2020, a new investigator got involved in trying to solve the Toomey mystery, but when he requested a copy of the files on the case, all there appeared to be was a VHS copy of the Unsolved Mysteries segment on the death. The investigator then discovered that the note found on Toomey's body had been kept by the Unsolved Mysteries producers. For some reason, the police never got the evidence back, or even chased the producer up for it, leading some to suggest that someone, somewhere, did not want the investigation into William Toomey to be taken too far. That's all for this entry into the tape library, and of course I want to hear your thoughts on this one. This is quite a confusing case with a lot of different characters and moving parts, so I hope I've been able to lay it out in at least a semi-clear way here. Despite being a slightly shorter episode, I think this was one of the more difficult ones to write for that reason. Let me know below if you have any theories on it, or if there are any important details you think I may have missed out. I'll be honest, when I started this episode, I did not expect it to end up where it did. My introduction to this was stumbling upon the Unsolved Mystery segment on this case, which literally just discussed Toomey's death, and I thought it would be an interesting one to talk about. I didn't expect the rabbit hole to be quite as dark as it ended up being. I rarely cover crime cases, unless there's something particularly unusual about them. I think delving into this one has reminded me why. So next episode we'll be jumping into some good old-fashioned high strangeness. Don't forget, if you want to hear more deep dives, then please do subscribe to the channel. And if you want to hear me reading out the paranormal stories you all send me, you can hear those over on my second channel, Night Drive Paranormal. So there's nothing left to do but to thank the people who made this episode possible. Our tape library archivists Umika Grimm, Tracy Torello, Sandy Lusk, Restock 1731, Mira, Judith Hacker, Gabrielle, Eric Salas, Destiny M, Ashlar's Books, Adeline, Peter McCann, Georgia Harvey, Gallego, Deppy Johnny, Dominic DeAngelis, Dean J. Daly, 1000th Ghost, London Grace, Simon Ulas, Callie Cott, Megan Reddin, Alfredo Sandoval, Darla, and Queen of Flatulence. The lead archivist Van Yell, Brian Baker, Old Soul Like Mine, Lord William, Xavier Angle, Tyler Michael, Ridiculous, Melissa Harrington, Alex O'Neill and Alex Goldberg, and our grand overseers for Evan, Morning Rain 2619, Katie, Agent 355, Brock Hampton, and Grim Reaper KL. Thank you all so much for your continued support, and to all my junior archivists and YouTube members as well. It all really makes a massive difference. Until next time, my friends, look after yourselves, and pleasant dreams.